Today's interview with Wren Vetens, a PhD student at CERN and a trans woman, has some anecdotes that I found genuinely shocking. It is full of honesty and admirable strength and determination, and despite everything, has an optimistic and positive note. I hope you enjoy listening as much as I did speaking to Wren.
You're listening to Insight, the University of St. Andrews Physics Society's podcast. I'm your host, Veronika Sedláková. Join us as we journey through the lives of academics, discovering their passions, inspiration, and motivation.
Hello everyone. Today we're speaking with Wren Vetens from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, who's doing her PhD thesis defense here in CERN. Hello, and thank you so much for joining.
Thank you for having me.
Great, thanks.
It's great to meet you. Great to be here.
Yeah, thank you so much. So let's go to the first question. What is your position here in CERN? So what does it involve, and what do you do at your home university?
So I'm as was mentioned before, I'm a PhD student at a university in the United States, and so my status at CERN is a user. I sort of am sent by my university as a representative to do my research on the CMS detector, which is one of the two large detectors at the LHC. There's sort of one on either end, Atlas and CMS, and they're the ones that jointly announce the Higgs boson. So I'm at the CMS, which is the one in the middle of nowhere in the French countryside, like 300 meters underground, on the other side of the ring from here.
I see. Thank you so much. Yeah, it's good to explain, especially for people who are external to CERN. It's very intransparent, this thing, right? And can you tell us a little bit about your path that led you here?
So my path, it's kind of a winding one. I've always had an interest in science, but growing up, I wasn't the best student, especially when it came to math, and the physics classes that were offered in my, especially younger, like high school education, were really not the best, and so I didn't really get that into physics or really feel that excited about it or care that much. And I didn't really like math either, pretty much until calculus, but at the time I was very interested in biology and biochemistry. Both of my parents are doctors, and so those were, if I had questions about science as a kid, those were the ones that they could answer. And I had a lot of questions because I'm sort of an existentially very anxious person, and so science was always very appealing to me because I could not only were there answers and sort of a procedure for finding them, but there was also things have a margin of error attached to them, so I could have a quantifiable description of exactly how certain we are in something. And because I'm a very uncertain person, any amount of certainty is a relief to me. And when I entered undergrad, I started taking a few more advanced math courses because I mentioned I liked calculus, and I realized that I liked math so much that I wanted to use it while I did science. And then from there, physics seemed like the most straightforward path. So I switched in my second year, which was kind of unusual. I really had to scramble when I was in undergrad. But I switched to physics. And there were a few reasons for that. I mean, partially it was the math and science thing, and partially, as I mentioned, I'm so anxious about the stupidest things. And so I read an article talking about the Higgs vacuum collapse scenario, which is essentially the Higgs boson from particle physics has a potential energy associated with it. Essentially, as the universe cooled after the Big Bang, the Higgs boson sort of settled in one particular configuration, but we don't know if there are other configurations, essentially, and if there are other configurations, there's a chance that it could quantum tunnel to a different configuration and fundamentally change the laws of the universe as we know it with very little warning. And that was terrifying to me. The fact that the universe could just end like that at the drop of a hat and there was nothing we could do about that scared me. And so I wanted to understand about that. And that was sort of the other reason that I started studying physics and got interested in it when I was in undergrad. And then I kept coming across other very interesting problems, things like the cosmological constant problem, which is essentially the cosmological constant is essentially a parameter that describes the concentration of dark energy in the universe. And dark energy is different from dark matter. Dark energy is essentially what drives the accelerating expansion of the universe, but dark matter is matter that we just can't see. So dark energy is a little bit different. It's sort of like a pressure that exists everywhere in the universe uniformly. And we didn't really, so the cosmological constant problem is essentially the what we've observed cosmologically and what we would predict using something like the standard model are things that turn out very, very different. It's complete orders of magnitude difference. The standard model cosmological constant prediction is absolutely enormous, and the one that we see is quite close to zero. So that was one thing, and then I thought, well, maybe I'll do astrophysics instead of the cosmological constant problem, or dark matter, which I mentioned is matter that we can't see, but we know it exists because we've seen it pulling on things gravitationally. And kept just encountering more and more things, and originally a lot of these seemed to be linked to gravity, and gravity is sort of a mystery force that we don't understand really the same way that we understand the other things in the standard model. We understand it from the perspective of general relativity, which is sort of on the opposite end of the spectrum from quantum mechanics. It's the physics of very, very large, very massive things, whereas quantum mechanics is the physics of very, very small, very light things. And we don't really know how to bridge the gap, and there are a lot of things that are potentially related to that. So as I continued my studies in undergrad, I jumped all over. I jumped from chemical physics at the beginning to astrophysics, and then finally, as I was finishing up my undergrad, I became very interested in gravity and general relativity and quantum gravity. And as a result, when I started graduate school at the University of Wisconsin-Madison in 2016, I was very set on going into string theory. I did the first 2 years of my PhD as a string theorist. I took all the theory courses, and I started doing some research with a professor, and I got to a point where I felt like I was starting to get things, and that was very exciting to me. But for a variety of reasons, I decided to change tack. And this sort of is getting into some of the other questions that we'll talk about later. We'll get into later why I changed tack in part, but eventually, after deciding that I didn't want to do string theory with my physics career, I decided to switch to experimental particle physics, which is what I do now. It felt like a very straightforward jump, but there is still a lot of difference, even though it's just a jump from theoretical physics to experimental physics, and it seemed small at the time, but there's a lot that I've had to learn still, and there's a lot that I have to learn. That's one thing that's constant, is there's always a lot that you have to learn. So that's how I finally found myself in experimental particle physics.
Awesome, thank you so much, and that's a cliffhanger. It is also a very interesting path, sort of crooked. Amazing to hear about. So what is your research now? What exactly, what topic are you doing?
So the way that things are grouped with the CMS experiment is that there's sort of like subgroups of experimental particle physics that we look at, basically different types of things that we're using the CMS detector. There are, I think, about 4,000 scientists in this collaboration, so it's a huge collaboration. Everyone's doing all kinds of different things, and we sort of group things by subgroups. So I'm in the exotic particles subgroup, which means usually it means particles that are beyond the standard model. And specifically, within the exotic particles subgroup, I am looking for something within the standard model. So it's a little counterintuitive, but essentially what I am looking for is a particle called a sexaquark, and that sounds like a very, very silly name, but it's an extension of particles that were recently discovered called tetra or pentaquarks, and it's using the Greek numbering scheme, which is why it's sexaquark rather than hexaquark. But a tetraquark is sort of a bound state of 4 quarks, and a pentaquark is a bound state of 5 quarks. This is opposed to particles like protons and neutrons, which are bound states of 3 quarks, and particles like pions, which are bound states of 2 quarks. Quarks being, I've used that word a lot, quarks are one of the fundamental particles of the standard model, which is sort of like the periodic table of elements, but for particle physics instead of for chemistry. And in the standard model, we have a class of particles called quarks that are sort of like electrons and their neutral cousins, the neutrinos, except quarks interact via the strong force. And the strong force is called the strong force because it's strong. It's very, very strong. It's so strong that you can't ever have a solo quark, because if you were to ever have a solo quark, it would pull quark-antiquark pairs out of the vacuum and surround itself with them until you have a neutral object under the strong force. And so that's why we've seen 2 quark particles, and we've seen 3 quark particles, and we've now seen 4 and 5 quark particles, but there are no just single quarks that we've observed. And that's also why a potentially interesting place to look would be for a 6 quark particles. And there are a few consequences of 6 quark particles that are potentially of interest. One of the main ones is that the particular sexaquark that I'm looking for is a bound state of 2 up quarks, 2 down quarks, and 2 strange quarks. Of the 6 different types of quarks, it uses 3 of them. And strange quarks are known for being a lot more stable than other quarks. Particles that have strange quarks in them take longer to decay than one would otherwise expect, because they have a conserved property called strangeness. So in this 6 quark particle, there are 2 strange quarks, and because of that, it is incredibly, incredibly long-lived. It's either entirely stable, or its lifetime is longer than the age of the universe under most models that we have for it. There's a lot of uncertainty exactly about what it looks like, but because of that, it's very long-lived. It's also electrically neutral, and what that means is that it could be a potential dark matter candidate. And what's very fascinating about that is the fact that it is dark matter, but still entirely within the standard model. You don't need to add, in principle, you don't need to add anything new if this were to be dark matter. Of course, we haven't observed it yet, and so that's what we're looking for. And in particular, I'm looking in a lot of data that was until very recently just kind of thrown out by the detector. So I sort of liken it to sorting through the garbage looking for gold. And it's something that is very interesting to me personally because it's looking in places that have been historically ignored by particle physics. It's looking in places that used to be thrown out, and it almost feels like my duty as a scientist to check there. Not only from the perspective of looking in data that is usually ignored for the purposes of other analyses. Basically, what that means is that it's data that wasn't very useful to discovering the Higgs, among other things. Since everything was pretty specialized for looking for the Higgs at first, there was a lot of other things that weren't as relevant to that search. But now that the Higgs has been found, we're sort of searching in other areas for other new physics. So in addition to looking in places we've overlooked, I'm looking for something that doesn't really require any new theoretical input. And so, for those reasons, it's a very compelling search for me, and it feels like the scientific method demands that I search there. So, it's a very compelling project for me.
I see. That sounds incredibly interesting. Yeah, I remember the hype about the discovery of the tetraquark and pentaquark, so I'll think about you when I hear about the sexaquark.
Thanks. I don't know, it probably, even if I find something, it probably would take a few years for things to really get through the approval process, and so you might need to wait a few years, but who knows?
Right. We're used to that now.
Yeah.
What is your favorite thing in this field? So, what is the one thing, if you were to point out why this research is great?
What's always drawn me to particle physics has been that it is the closest to answering a lot of really fundamental questions about the universe for me. At least ones that I have. I mean, a lot of physics tackles very fundamental questions in a lot of different ways, but for questions about the very building blocks of the universe, and a lot of questions relating to the birth of the universe and the formation of the universe, a lot of these can be addressed through particle physics, and it does it by looking at the smallest building blocks we can find. So that's very compelling to me because I mentioned that I'm a very anxious person, and so I need to be as certain as possible, and that means looking at the smallest pieces I can find of nature.
And what is the daily part that you enjoy the most? Is it like computer analysis or the maths that you do with equations, or what is the thing that you enjoy? Conferences?
That's a difficult question. I mentioned that I used to be a theorist, and I think the mathematical formalism is still what I enjoy the most, and what I find myself thinking about and looking back to is the formalism. I think about the standard model. I think about possible extensions to that. And unfortunately, that's not something that's quite as day-to-day. Day-to-day, I'm essentially just coding on the computer. I'm trying to write algorithms to process this data and deciding on different parameters to narrow down the data set that I'm looking at, because it's such a huge amount of data that you need to exclude certain things. Otherwise, it would take years to run your analysis. So I think the part that's most fascinating to me is still the formalism, but the day-to-day, I much prefer the programming and data analysis side of things to the actual physical detector work. I'm not very good at electronics, and in fact, in my first electronics class, I was sort of known by the professor for setting things on fire by mistake. So when I can do things on the software side, it's really better for everybody involved. Everybody has their weak and strong suits, and I don't set things on fire now. I want to be clear, but it's easier for me to work with software than hardware, because I mentioned a few times that I'm very anxious person, and when I get nervous my hands start to tremble, and if I'm trying to build a circuit or do a precise measurement, it's makes things more difficult. Especially if I'm working with $1 million piece of equipment that I can't break. That's very scary, and then the pressure's on, and then my hands are trembling even more, and
that definitely doesn't.
Yeah, so I prefer to work with computers over circuits for that reason.
You can usually go back on them.
Exactly. Yeah, there's a backspace button on the computer.
Yeah,
there isn't in real life.
Yeah, that's a great thing. Going to a different bucket of questions, I would say. Can you speak a little bit of the CERN LGBT plus network, and if you're a member?
Yeah. So I'm a member, and I have been since I came out here in 2019. Since I moved out here in 2019, I've been out since 2013. It's weird, but yeah, I'm a member of the network. We have weekly lunches is probably the most frequent thing, and usually there's, on slower weeks, just 2 or 3 people that come, and on weeks where there are more people here and more people available, there have been upwards of 10. It's really variable, because a lot of the people that come are users rather than CERN staff. It's great fun. I mean, it's a large portion of my social life is the CERN LGBT group. Yeah, we also sometimes do things like we have queer movie nights, and sometimes we go to gay bars in town, depending on what people are into. There are often activities, and oftentimes people will just email the list if they're planning on doing something the weekend, and see if other people are interested in joining. So it's a very friendly group. There are a lot more people that are actually on the mailing list, but because so many of us are users rather than staff, a lot of people are out of town at any given time.
Oh, I actually surprised me. I expected so much more people.
Yeah, it's kind of a shame, and the reason why there aren't as many staff has to do with the area. A lot of people at CERN end up living not in Geneva, but on the French side. Essentially, Geneva is right on the border of Switzerland and France, and the city of Geneva is in France, but the LHC straddles the border of Geneva and France. A lot of people live on the French side, and it's rural France, and it's also, a STEM job, so there are a lot of really macho doodly dudes who show up, and that's not necessarily an environment where a lot of people feel safe being out. So there are a few staff members who come fairly regularly, but what I've heard from them is that they know a lot of people who aren't out publicly, and as a result, it's harder for them to come to these meetings.
And did you have any negative experience during your career because of your identity?
Yes, a fair amount. It's and this is sort of what I hinted at earlier. The way that discrimination can work for a lot of people is that it's never just one thing. It's always sort of an intersection, and when you have an issue in one area, in one aspect of your identity, other aspects of your identity can complicate it and make it harder. So I've had instances of discrimination or harassment from colleagues or advisors that have been really stressful, both before and after making the switch. But a lot of the cases are more complicated than just someone calling me a slur or something like that. And I think that things are a lot better now than they were even a few years ago, for a variety of reasons, but also nothing's perfect. So I've had coworkers say things like they pay to see me dance or something like that, and that was really, really gross. But at the end of the day, that's like someone saying something gross, and you can, if you're feeling confident, yell at them, or you can avoid them. But things like when I was still working in string theory, we were sort of expected to spend 80 plus hours a week just on string theory. And when you're also a teaching assistant, because you need to pay for school and pay the bills, that gets extra hard to do if you want to eat anything other than instant ramen and have friends. And I think that part of the reason why that attitude exists, especially in theoretical physics, is that it's still such a cishet male-dominated field that the sorts of people who can do it are either from wealthy enough backgrounds that they can just ask for money from their parents when they need it, and so they need to do things like teaching assistantships less, or they can just, order food from wherever they want and pay people to do their laundry for them and things like that. Or if you're, a heterosexual man in a heterosexual relationship and you're living with your girlfriend can do all of the housework for you. And and so the expectation of 80 hours a week, it's already pretty unreasonable to ask that from anybody, in my opinion, but it's even more unreasonable to ask that from anyone who isn't a cishet white guy. If you're from a disadvantaged economic background and you have family to take care of, for example, that's another complicating factor. So this is kind of what I was talking about how like different kinds of oppressions will intersect and make issues that might seem one-sided from one perspective a lot more complicated and a lot more difficult to deal with. So in addition, like I'm neurodivergent and I have ADHD, and I was in the process of trying to seek accommodations for that, and I got really strongly discouraged from doing so. I actually had a professor tell me flat out to my face that if I got diagnosed and got accommodations for that my professors would know and would be less likely to write me good recommendations because of that. So theory especially was still a very hostile place for me, and I loved it. And there was a time when I was willing to just eat nothing but instant ramen and do it. But I realized that I cared about more things than just physics, and I needed to have a life. And I think that those are reasonable things for any human being to expect. And I convinced myself that I could do it if I really wanted to, if I really tried, if I really wanted to push myself, but also that at the end of the day, it wouldn't be worth it. And that I had already learned from theory, taken from theory what I really wanted to know, what I really wanted to understand. And I convinced myself that I could really learn anything if I set my mind to it, and that was what I needed from it. So that's when I made the jump from theory to experiment.
It's very distressing to hear, especially such toxic environment that it was.
Yeah, there's sort of the at least with this advisor, there was sort of the understanding that if you wanted to continue on in academia, there were 3 hires a year in all of theoretical physics. Usually one of them went to the best guy from Princeton, one of them went to the best guy from Oxford, or Cambridge, excuse me, not Oxford, and the third one went to a Harvard professor's kid at Harvard, or something like that. And when I say guy, I mean guy as well. And that there are, of course, like exceptions to that rule, but the exceptions to that rule happen when people are able to put 100 hours a week into it, and that just wasn't something that I felt healthy doing long term.
I don't think that's healthy for anyone.
Yeah.
Or for physics.
Yeah. So experimental particle physics has been a lot better in a lot of regards. It's still not perfect. I mean, the colleague who said he'd pay to watch me dance is an experimental particle physics, for example. And that there have been like other instances of people like, yeah, I'm transgender, and people have like asked weird invasive questions about my genitals, for example. But the thing about things like that, like microaggressions, or maybe those weren't so micro, but the thing about things like that, it's easier to like cuss someone out or ignore it than something that has a lot more material impact on your health and your well-being in your life. And I understand that in a lot of aspects, I'm still very lucky. I'm white, and I'm from a pretty privileged background. And in that regard, those microaggressions to me felt like microaggressions, and they might not to other people. So I'd like to sort of acknowledge the fact that it might not be that some people can brush those things off sometimes, and other people can't. And it's even hard for me to brush those things off. I mean, it was hard for me to come into the office for a while because the people that were treating me like that were around. And now that's less the case, but I still sometimes keep to myself. So it's not perfect, but it's a lot more doable. I'm able to have a life outside of physics, and that is so much more important to me than a few assholes.
I see. So you touched on this, but do you have any ideas of what should be done in academia to improve inclusivity?
I think that fast-tracking people from marginalized backgrounds to better positions is one thing that can be done, but the structure of academia is always going to be one that privileges certain people. And I mean, that's sort of the nature of how tenure works, and the fact that we produce a lot more PhDs than there are tenured professor positions. And I think that a few things that can really address that beyond just putting the right people in positions of power is by giving more power and benefits to people who aren't in those positions. I think that improving graduate student pay and working conditions are very, very important. I mean, for example, if we made enough to pay people to do our laundry, then it would be easier for everybody to do 80 hours a week on physics and still, be able to hang out with friends once a week or something like that. So paying graduate students better, giving them better benefits is one of the main things, and better working hours, better working conditions, and also not just that, but lecturers too. Lecturers and postdocs, people who are more senior than graduate students, but don't have the staying power that tenured professors do. I think that those are the sorts of things that are going to improve the material conditions of people's lives far more than essentially putting someone else in the same position of power, because these structures of power existing is what caused problems like this in the first place. But I think that there is hope for that, especially given I exist in sort of a very U.S. context, but there's been a lot of movements to unionize different graduate workforces across the U.S. that have and can continue to lead to a lot of very material increases to the conditions of graduate workers and of adjunct faculty and things of that nature. And I think that those have a lot more potential to bring about change than just changing who's in power.
That's hopeful. Let's keep our fingers crossed, and let's stay watching this. It's interesting to hear that you have very similar points to Patrick, which I interviewed about a year ago from St. Andrews, and it's very interesting to hear. And do you have what are the differences, or if you find any differences between, for example, the US and here, Switzerland/France?
Yes. So one thing in obviously there are a lot of differences. I mean, when I first moved out here, for example, there wasn't marriage equality in Switzerland. That was something that passed only in the past couple of years. That's one big difference. Not really that I came out here planning to get married, but just in terms of the amount of progress that has happened over the course of years is really big. But also, one thing that I've still noticed is that there aren't a lot of local transgender women that I have met. Pretty much all the other trans women in the area that I know of are expats. That doesn't mean that we aren't around. It just means that we aren't out, because we're everywhere. And I think that's because there's still a lot of medical gatekeeping in the healthcare system, among other things. And there's also a lot of homophobia and transphobia in just people. I mean, I mentioned that there are a lot more staff at CERN that are having difficulty feeling safe coming out. I've also noticed that when I go out in public, even in Geneva, I get harassed a lot more than if I had been in the US. And I think there's a confluence of factors here. I think partially the fact that I don't know as many local people, and so because of that, I don't know the safer places to go to or the people to hang out with. But the amount of times I have had weirdos like throw things at me on the street or corner me and start asking questions about my genitals in public is a lot higher than in the US. And that doesn't mean it hasn't happened in the US. It just means that being visibly trans here is a different experience than being visibly trans in the US. It sort of reminds me a lot of when I was first coming out in the US. I think, in part, it's a cultural thing. I mean, French, for example, is a very whorephobic language. Pretty much all of the slurs and all of the swear words have to do with prostitutes, and because there's a very strong cultural association of transgender people with sex workers, it's not too big of a stretch of the imagination to sort of infer that the treatment that sex workers get is similar to the treatment that transgender people get, especially transgender women. And in addition, French as a language is very gendered, and that comes with its own challenges. There are a lot of movements in French to introduce more gender-inclusive language, but there's an institutional force in the French language which opposes that, called l'Académie Française, that essentially exists to enforce a standard of French that is very, very resistant to change. And there are reasons beyond just new thing bad that's the case. It's sort of in part there's like a cultural preservation thing, and especially now it's sort of has protected against a lot of like American hegemony. So I think that there are good things to it. There are some good things that it has done, but as an institution, it can provide a lot of barriers linguistically speaking. And that's only linguistically. I mean, and that's only because there's enough of a gap between expats and townies, so to speak, like the people who live in Geneva and the people who are here for like the UN or CERN or something like that. There's enough of a cultural gap and a material gap, and even living in other places and going to different places. There's enough of a gap still there that my understanding of the local culture has suffered, and that's a shame. And of course, COVID made that a lot harder. I was really trying to make local friends and expose myself to the local scene, but then when COVID happened, I sort of stopped going to bars and stopped going to social events for a few years, and that sort of put the brakes on that, as well as on my French language progression. So very long answer, but it's complicated in a lot of ways. It's worse, but at the same time, you know, the U.S. isn't really looking bright either. Especially, there's a lot of things going on in the U.S. that are very scary from an institutional perspective that I don't think that I would have to worry about here. And it's for that reason that I think that I would probably rather live here long term than the US, because things are on the up and up here, and right now in the US they're a lot less certain.
No, thank you for sharing, because again, awful to hear how much progress there is still to be done.
Yeah. Sorry, I've mentioned this before. I'm a bit of a pessimist. I'm a bit of an anxious person. So sometimes that comes across. I think in part I'm very critical because I have so much hope and I see so many things to be done that I sort of tend to view bad things as areas for improvement rather than the end all be all.
Okay, I see. And by the way, I just find it interesting. Here came 2019, and then 2020, obviously COVID happened, and everything stopped. But you touched upon the differences between the expat community and the Geneva community. I think a colleague told me about a study that there are basically like three very distinct populations in Geneva. One is the people living on the French side. One is the local Geneva people. And one is the huge part of Geneva that are expats, and they rarely interact with each other. So it's very hard to reach out to the other people.
Yeah, I think if there were less alienation between those three sort of spheres, I think that a lot more progress could be made. And that's part of why I was really trying to make local friends go to local things, but
perhaps now that
I lost some of the momentum for that. But now that things are calming down a bit, I'd like to try again.
Going to a more, I guess, a lighter topic. What do you like to do in your free time?
Well, I have pet reptiles that I like to take care of. I have 3 pets. I have a snake, a ball python, or royal python, as they say in the UK. And I have 2 lizards, a New Caledonian giant gecko and a Indonesian blue-tongued skink. And I like to read a lot, and I like to read about a lot of different things, and a lot of those things are animals. I mentioned, growing up, always having an interest in biology as well, and animals. But even though I switched to physics, those other passions never really left me behind. So a lot of what I do is just like reading. I like keeping reptiles in particular because terrariums are sort of like their own enclosed little ecosystem, and you can have like plants, you can have detritivores that process like animal waste into fertilizer for the plants. So you can have almost a little ecosystem in there with your pets. I like that a lot. I also like to read a lot of comics, and I'm pretty active with the CERN Games Club as well. I run a Dungeons and Dragons campaign once a week. And then there's also like a board game group that meets on Sundays, and I'm the treasurer for the CERN Games Club. Yeah, so that's. I also really like horror movies. So I try to watch with my roommate. We try to watch a horror movie a week, and that's a lot of fun.
I see. You're brave.
I didn't always like horror movies, but they're a bit of an acquired taste. But there's actually a lot of depth to them, and I think a lot of horror movies are sort of really interesting when viewed as metaphors for trauma. And as someone who has a lot of trauma, it's very interesting, and it's very emotionally cathartic for me.
That's why I say you're brave.
Yeah.
Let's go to a quick round, the final round of the question. We like to call quickfire questions, so they usually have a bit like shorter answers, but feel free to elaborate if you want to. I guess the first one is an easy one. What's your favorite animal?
My favorite animal? It's very hard for me to pick favorites, but I like frogs. I'd like to have a pet frog one day, but they're kind of complicated to take care of because water is really complicated, chemically speaking, when you're managing like animal waste. But I like frogs a lot. I just think they're so cute.
You're not going to like this round then.
Yeah, I know.
I call them 5-year-old questions. Yeah. What's your favorite this and that?
Yeah. I was a very weird 5-year-old, so.
Oh, why?
It didn't have favorites. I was really into animals, but it wasn't about favorites. It was about just like trying to cram as much into my noggin as possible about like frogs and bugs and lizards and just pretty much any animal. I was really into animals when I was 5, but it wasn't like a favorite thing. It was just like and dinosaurs. Dinosaurs. That's the other thing. I was a dinosaur kid.
Of course, yeah, dinosaurs. Then what's your favorite kind of pizza?
Eggplant pizza, like fried eggplant on pizza, and mushrooms. That's another good pizza topping. But fried eggplant, fried eggplant's really good.
That's really nice. And do you have a favorite book?
I'd have to say that I read this and I had a lot of thought about this. I'd say The Dispossessed by Ursula K. Le Guin. That book really changed a lot of how I think about the world. It's a book that's had a huge impact on me. It's the main character of the book is a physicist. So if you're interested in physics, I highly recommend giving it a read. But it's really good.
I see. Awesome. Well, what kind of music do you like to listen to? What's your favorite genre and a favorite song?
This is another one where I have difficulty picking favorites. I actually I play bass. That's another hobby I didn't mention. But before I moved out here, I was in a punk band as the bassist. So a lot of what I like to listen to is punk. In particular, one of my favorite groups is the Mountain Goats. I guess they're kind of punk adjacent, but my favorite song would be "This Year" by the Mountain Goats. It's always a very relevant song because the chorus essentially goes, "I am gonna make it through this year if it kills me." So, you know, for the ever since 2020, that's been, well, really ever since 2016 when Donald Trump got elected, it's been very relevant just every single step of my life.
Oh yeah. yeah. Well, we're gonna make it.
Yeah.
And is there a place that you haven't visited and where you would like to go?
So many. I really like Lord of the Rings, and so I'd really like to go to New Zealand. I also really want to go to Iceland and Japan and Korea and Australia and Brazil. So many places. I like to travel. My partner lives in Singapore, and we like so I go to Singapore a lot, and Singapore is close to a lot of really interesting places. So I have a lot of travel in my future that I'm very excited about.
That'll be great. And finally, what's your drink of choice?
Green tea.
Green tea.
Yeah, I like green tea a lot, especially matcha and genmaicha. Those are my two favorite kinds of green tea.
Mm-hmm.
Genmaicha would be green tea with toasted barley mixed in. Matcha is like the green tea powder.
Yeah, the one with the brush.
Yeah.
Do you call it
the
brush?
whisk?
Oh, whisk. Okay, sorry. And finally, getting to the finishing question. Where is the time? So feel free to elaborate on this one if you'd like to. If there was one thing that you wish you knew as a student before looking for a PhD, what would it be?
That's a question that I tried to think about, and it's hard for me to come up with a really good answer still. I think the knowledge that it's okay to take your time, that there's no rush for these things, that I could have taken a break from school and worked for a bit, and it would have turned out okay. You don't need to push yourself beyond your limits. It's okay to take it easy, and in the long term, it's better to listen to yourself and your own needs rather than to really force yourself. I have to go to the best school, the best program. I need to go to the most prestigious place and study the most prestigious thing, and taking the time to listen to not what maybe society or your family or your imposter syndrome are telling you, and more just listening to what brings you joy is a much more sustainable approach.
Thank you so much for this message. I think it's important that we hear this. Thank you so much for the interview as well. It was a pleasure listening to you. Thank you so much for joining.
It was a pleasure talking. Thank you for having me.
You've been listening to Insight, the University of St. Andrews Physics Society's podcast. Thanks to our wonderful interviewees for sharing their interesting and useful insights. To find out more about the Physics Society and what we do, find us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, or search St. Andrews Physics Society for our website. Goodbye!